Let me tell you something about the kind of land nobody wants. It sits there, quiet, patient. The fences sag and the grass grows wild and the county sends a tax bill once a year that gets stuffed in a drawer by whoever last cared until one day nobody cares at all. That's how a piece of the earth gets forgotten. Not lost, forgotten. There's a difference. Lost means someone's still looking. Forgotten means the looking stopped a long time ago. I've spent 40 years around men who chase fortunes, and I'll tell you what I learned watching Ezra Kane sign his name on a deed for $1,100. The biggest treasures in this world don't announce themselves. They wait behind rotting doors, under decades of dust, inside the walls of buildings so ugly and so far gone that every sensible person walks right past them. And they wait for the one fool stubborn enough or broken enough to look closer. You're going to want to know what was in that barn, I understand, but I'm asking you to hold that question a while the way I had to, because the thing about Ezra's story is that the fortune was never really the point. The point was the man who almost didn't live long enough to find it. Stay with me. This one earned every minute. The first time I saw Ezra Kane, he was on his knees in the dirt, and I thought he was praying. He wasn't. He was too proud for that even then. He was just looking at the ground the way a man looks at something that has taken everything from him, his wife, his savings, and that particular week, what was left of his cattle. 23 head, dead in a season that came in cruel and dry and stayed that way. I found him out on that old ranch road with the sun going flat and orange behind him, and he didn't hear my truck until I was almost on top of him. He stood up slow, dusted his knees, looked at me with eyes the color of creek water in a drought and said, "You lost." "Everybody's a little lost out here," I told him. He almost smiled. Almost. I'd learn in the months to come that almost was the whole shape of the man. Almost broke, almost gone, almost giving up 100 times over and never quite doing it. My name doesn't matter much to this story. I ran the feed store in the nearest town, 40 minutes of washboard road from anywhere, and I'd been driving out to check on the old Halloran place because the bank had finally given up on it and somebody said a stranger had moved onto the land. That stranger was Ezra. He'd bought the whole spread, 300 and some acres, a collapsing house, and a barn so old it leaned like a drunk against the evening, for $1,100 at a county auction that 4 people attended. I remember thinking, poor bastard paid $1,100 too much. I keep a little notebook, always have. My wife used to tease me about it, the man who writes down the weather. I wrote down that first meeting. I wrote Kane, widower, I think. Looks like a man who's been carrying something heavy so long he's forgotten it's not part of his body. I don't know how I knew he was a widower. You just know sometimes. Grief has a posture. To understand why a man buys forgotten land, you have to understand what he's trying to forget. I got the story in pieces, over months, the way you get anything real out of a private man. Never asked for, always half-accidental, usually offered in the dark of a truck cab or across a fence line when the work made talking easier than silence. Ezra had a ranch once, a real one up north, 400 head and a wife named Colleen who could rope better than most men and laughed like she meant it. They'd built it together over 11 years, starting with nothing, the way the good ones always start. And then the drought came, the big one, the one that dried up half the state and turned good cattlemen into bankrupt ones in the space of 2 summers. He'd held on longer than he should have. Sold the truck. Sold Colleen's horse, which she never forgave the world for, though she forgave him. Mortgaged everything twice. And then Colleen got sick. He didn't tell me the details of it, and I didn't ask. Some grief you don't go poking at. All I know is that the medical bills finished what the drought started, and that she died in a county hospital 2 hours from the ranch they'd built, and that by the time they put her in the ground, the ranch was already gone, sold at auction to a corporation that bulldozed the house within the month. They tore down the porch, he told me once out of nowhere while we were mending a fence. She loved that porch, sat out there every morning of her life, took him about 20 minutes to knock it flat. He drove a staple into the post hard. 20 minutes. 11 years and 20 minutes. He had a photograph. I saw it maybe twice. Kept it in his breast pocket, wrapped in a bit of oilcloth to keep the sweat off it. Colleen on a fence rail, hat pushed back mid-laugh. He never showed it on purpose. It just slipped out sometimes when he reached for his tobacco, and he'd tuck it back quick, like a man hiding a wound. So that's the man. 51 years old, everything he'd ever built turned to dust and memory, and $1,100 of borrowed money in his pocket. He could have gone anywhere. He could have taken a job in an oil town, made real wages, slept in a real bed. Instead, he bought the ugliest, most forgotten piece of land in the county and went to work on it alone. And when I asked him why early on, before I understood, he gave me the only answer he ever really gave. Because it's the only thing left, he said, that nobody can take from me. It's already worthless. You can't steal something nobody wants. I wrote that down too. The work was brutal, and I watched it nearly kill him. You have to understand what 300 neglected acres do to a body. The fences were 40 years failed. The wells were fouled. The land itself had gone to mesquite and prickly pear and hardpan soil that turned a shovel back at you like it was insulted. He had no tractor, no hired hands, no money to fix any of it. He had a mule he traded a rifle for, a set of hand tools, and a stubbornness that I came over that year to regard as something close to a natural disaster. He was up before light every day. I know because I'd come by sometimes at dawn with supplies I pretended I was just passing along, and he'd already have 3 hours of work behind him, shirt soaked through, moving with the grim mechanical rhythm of a man who has decided that stopping is the same as dying. He cleared brush by hand. He dug post holes in that iron ground one at a time, and there were hundreds of them. He walked miles a day fixing what a whole crew should have been fixing. And he was starving. He wouldn't say it, but I saw it. The way his belt notched tighter month over month, the way his hands started to shake in the afternoons. He was spending his money on wire and seed and feed for the mule, and eating whatever the land gave him, which in those first months was almost nothing. I brought food when I could without insulting him. It's a delicate thing feeding a proud man. You can't hand it to him. You have to leave it or trade for it or pretend you cooked too much. I'd say, "Wife made a whole pot of beans, more than we can eat. Do me a favor and take some off my hands." I don't have a wife anymore. She'd been gone 6 years by then. But Ezra never called me on it, and I never explained, and the beans got eaten. And that was its own kind of conversation between two men who understood each other. There was a night, I'll never forget it, when I found him passed out in the dirt beside a half-dug post hole. Heat and hunger and exhaustion, all three. I got him into the shade of the barn and made him drink water and eat a sandwich, and he came around slow, ashamed, and the first thing he said, before he even had his wits, was, "Did I finish the hole? Did I finish the hole? Lord, that's the whole man in 4 words." I told him the hole could wait. I told him he was going to work himself into a grave next to Colleen's, and did he think that's what she'd want? It was a cruel thing to say, and I said it because I was scared. He looked at me a long time. Then he said, quiet, "She'd want me to stop hurting. This is me stopping hurting. Only way I know how." I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't, really. Some men grieve with tears. Some grieve with whiskey. Ezra grieved with a shovel, 10 hours a day, in ground that fought him for every inch, and maybe that was the only medicine that could reach where he was hurting. The barn was the last thing he touched, and the barn is where this story turns. It's a strange thing about that barn, he avoided it. All those months clearing and digging and mending, and he left the barn alone like it was somebody else's business. I asked him about it once. He shrugged. House to fix, fences to run, barns not going anywhere. It stood 90 years leaning like that. It'll keep. But I don't think that was the real reason. I think the barn scared him a little, and I'll tell you why I think so. That barn was old. Older than the ranch, older than the county records went back clean. It had been built by the original homesteader family, the Hallorans, back before the First War, and it had a look to it, a presence, that made even a practical man walk slower going past it. The wood had gone silver-black with age. The great doors sagged on hinges the size of a man's forearm. Inside, when you cracked the door, the light came down in blades through the gaps in the roof, and lit up 90 years of dust hanging in the air like something holy and forgotten. And it was full, that was the thing, full of the leavings of 4 generations who'd lived and worked and died on that land. Old harness, broken machinery, crates and barrels and furniture stacked to the rafters, all of it draped in dust and pigeon mess and the webs of 1,000 dead summers. The Hallorans had never thrown anything away. They just kept stacking it in the barn, decade after decade, and then the last of them had died with no heirs, and the land had gone to the bank, and the barn had sat there sealed and forgotten while the world moved on. Ezra could have cleared it out in a week if he'd wanted the space, but he didn't touch it, not for months. Until the winter came, and the winter changed things. I need to tell you about the winter, because the winter almost ended everything, and because what happened in the winter is what finally drove Ezra into that barn. It came early and it came hard. The first real cold snap took the last of his tomatoes and most of his hope in a single night, and Ezra, who had poured every dollar and every ounce of strength into that land through the fall, found himself, come December, with almost nothing. No cattle yet. He was still a year from being able to stock the place. No crop to sell. His borrowed 1,100 long spent and then some. He was living on beans and pride and the occasional deer, and the pride was running lower than the beans. I came out one bitter morning and found him sitting on the porch step of that half-fixed house with a letter in his hand. His face was gray. I thought for a second he was having a heart attack. The letter was from the county. The taxes on the land, the taxes he'd forgotten, the taxes nobody had thought to warn him about, were due. $240, and if he couldn't pay them, the land would go back to auction. All of it. Every post hole, every mile of fence, every ounce of himself he'd poured into that dirt over 8 months of killing labor. He'd bought the land because nobody could take it from him, and now somebody could, for $240. He laughed. It was a terrible sound. "You know what's funny?" he said. "I don't even have it. I don't have $240. I don't have 40. I spent it all making this place worth stealing again." I offered to pay it. Of course I did. He wouldn't hear it. We had a fight about it, right there on the porch, the only real fight we ever had, him telling me he'd sooner lose the land than take charity, me telling him he was too proud to live, both of us saying things we didn't mean, and in the end I drove off angry and he stayed on that step, and I lay awake all that night sick with the certainty that his pride was going to cost him everything. But here's what I didn't know. Here's what changed everything. That same night, cold and cornered and out of every other option, Ezra Kane picked up a lantern and walked out to the one part of his land he'd been avoiding for 8 months. He was going to sell what he could, break down the old machinery for scrap, haul out whatever the Hallorans had left, and see if any of it was worth $240 to somebody. It was the last thing he had left to try. He pulled open those great sagging doors for the first time. He held up the lantern, and in the trembling light, 90 years of forgotten dust rose up around him, and something in the back of that barn caught the flame and threw it back. He told me later he thought it was ice at first, the way it glinted. It wasn't ice. He didn't sleep that night, and in the morning when I drove back out, still angry, still ashamed of the angry, meaning to force the tax money on him one way or another, I found the barn doors thrown wide open, and Ezra Kane standing in the middle of that ancient dark with his hat in his hands and his whole body shaking, and he turned to look at me with an expression I had never seen on him and have never seen since. It was not joy. That's what I want you to understand before we go on. Whatever was in that barn, the look on his face when I found him was not joy. It was something much stranger, something closer to fear. "You need to come see this," he said. His voice didn't sound like his own. You need to come see this, and then you need to help me decide what I'm going to do, because if this is what I think it is." He stopped, he looked back into the dark, and he said the thing I've thought about every day since. "Then I finally have something worth losing again, and I don't know if I can live through losing again. I want to tell you what was in that barn now. I've made you wait long enough, and you've been patient, and a man who's been patient deserves his answer. But I need you to understand the shape of it first, because it wasn't one thing. That's what nobody gets right when they tell this story around town, and they do tell it still, in versions that get grander and stupider every year. They say Ezra Kane found gold. They say he found a chest of pirate silver, out here 1,000 miles from any ocean. They say all kinds of things, because the truth is quieter than the legend, and quiet doesn't travel as well in a bar. Here's the truth. The Hallorans had been many things over their 90 years on that land. Homesteaders first. Then, for a stretch in the 20s and 30s, something else, something the family had been careful about, careful enough that the county never quite knew. The old man of that generation, a fellow named Josiah Halloran, had been a horse trader who dealt across 3 states and into Mexico, back when a handshake and a good eye were worth more than any bank. And Josiah Halloran had not trusted banks. Not after 29. Not after he watched neighbors lose everything paper to the crash while his horses, real things, breathing things, kept their worth. So Josiah had done what a certain kind of man did in those years. He'd kept his wealth where he could put his hands on it, and he'd hidden it in the one place no thief would ever think to dig through: the bottomless, cluttered, worthless-looking chaos of his own barn. Ezra walked me back through it slow, that morning, with the lantern still lit even though the day was up, because the light didn't reach the far corners. The glint he'd seen the night before, the thing he'd thought was ice, was a set of silver-mounted saddles. 6 of them. Parade saddles, the kind a wealthy rancher would have commissioned for show, hand-tooled leather crusted black with age but the silver underneath still catching light, worked with a craftsmanship that doesn't exist anymore because the men who could do it are all dead. Just one of those saddles, Ezra would learn, was worth more than his old ranch had sold for. There were 6. But the saddles were only the start. Behind them, under tarps gone to powder, were crates, and in the crates, wrapped in oilcloth and newspaper from 1931, was Josiah Halloran's real fortune. Coins. Not treasure chest coins, not doubloons. Working money, the money of the era, gold pieces, $20 double eagles by the hundred, silver dollars in canvas sacks so heavy the rotted cloth split when Ezra tried to lift one, and spilled a river of silver across the barn floor. He said it made a sound he'd never forget. Like rain, he said, like rain in a drought. And there was more, and this is the part that got Ezra, the part that put that strange fear on his face instead of joy. Because tucked among the coins, in a flat tin box gone orange with rust, were the papers, deeds, bearer bonds, and letters, Josiah Halloran's letters in a cramped old man hand, explaining where it all came from, and more than that, explaining why. Explaining that he'd hidden it for his grandchildren. That he wanted the family to have something real, something that couldn't be taken by any bank or any drought or any crash. That he'd built it slow, over a lifetime, so that the people he loved would never have to be afraid. Those grandchildren had died without ever finding it. The letters had waited 90 years in the dark for a family that never came looking. And now, a stranger stood over them. A stranger who had lost his own everything, who understood better than any man alive exactly what Josiah Halloran had been trying to do for the people he loved. That's why Ezra wasn't smiling. He was holding another man's love letter to a family that never got to read it. He was standing in the middle of a fortune built by a man trying to protect his people from exactly the kind of ruin that had swallowed Ezra whole. He did it, Ezra said, and his voice cracked on it. He did what I couldn't do. He kept them safe, and they never even knew. Now, here is where the story becomes a story, and not just a lucky man in a barn. Because Ezra Kane had a decision to make, and it was not the decision you'd think. The land was his, Bought clean and legal at county auction, the deed in his name, and everything on that land by every law in the state belonged to him. The saddles, the coins, the gold, all of it. There wasn't a lawyer in the country who'd say otherwise. He could load it in a truck and drive it to a dealer and never work another day in his life. He was, standing in that barn, a wealthy man. All he had to do was pick it up. And Ezra Kane spent 3 days trying to give it away. I was there for most of it, and I'll be honest with you, I didn't understand at first. I thought grief had cracked something in him. Here was a man who'd been starving a week before, a man who couldn't scrape together $240 for taxes, and he was on the phone with the county records office and the historical society and a genealogist 2 states away, trying to find out if Josiah Halloran had any living kin. Any at all. Anyone with a claim. "It's not mine," he kept saying. "He didn't hide it for me, he hid it for his family." "His family's gone, Ezra," I told him. "You checked, everybody checked, there's nobody." "Then I have to be sure there's nobody before I—" He couldn't finish it. He put the papers down like they were hot. I understood it finally on the 3rd day. It wasn't about the law. Ezra knew the law was on his side. It was about the letters. It was about a man who had lost his own family, standing over the fortune of another man who tried so hard to save his, and knowing that if he simply took it, if he just scooped it up and got rich off it, he'd be doing to Josiah Halloran's love the same thing the corporation had done to Colleen's porch, taking something sacred and turning it into money in 20 minutes. He couldn't do it, not until he was sure. His whole broken heart wouldn't let him. The genealogist called back on the evening of the 3rd day. She'd found the end of the Halloran line, a granddaughter, dead in 1994, no children. No one. The family was gone, root and branch, and had been for 30 years. There was no one left to give it to. Ezra sat with the phone in his hand, a long time after she'd hung up. And then he did something I'll carry to my own grave. He walked back out to the barn, and he took Josiah Halloran's letters, just the letters, not the money, and he read every one of them out loud, alone in the dark, to a family that would never hear them. I stood outside the doors and I heard him. A man's voice, rough and slow, reading another dead man's love out into 90 years of empty air, so that at least one time before they were gone forever, those words would be spoken by a living mouth to the ones they were meant for. Even if the ones they were meant for were only dust and memory now. Then he came out and his face was wet, and he was finally, a little bit at peace. "All right," he said. "All right, I'll take care of it. I'll take care of all of it." He didn't get rich the way the town says he got rich. Or rather, he got rich, but he didn't get rich the way rich men get rich. He paid the taxes first. $240 out of a fortune. And I swear he handed that check to the county clerk with more satisfaction than any of the millions gave him. Then he did the thing that made me understand, once and for all, exactly what kind of man had been kneeling in that dirt the day I met him. He kept the land. He kept enough of the money to stock it proper, cattle, a tractor, a well that ran clean, a house with a porch. And the rest, the great bulk of that 90-year fortune, Josiah Halloran's life's work of love. He put it toward other people's callings. He set up a fund, a quiet one, no name attached, run through the county. It paid medical bills for ranch families who got caught the way he got caught, the way Colleen got caught between the drought and the bank and the hospital, in that killing gap where good hardworking people lose everything to a stroke of bad luck and a system that doesn't care. He funded it with Josiah Halloran's gold. He never told anyone it was him. To this day, most of the county doesn't know. They think a rich man found a treasure and kept it. They don't know that treasure has quietly paid the way for 30-some families over the years who'd have lost their land, their homes, their people, the way Ezra lost his. He hid it to keep a family safe, Ezra told me, the one time we ever spoke of it plainly. I figured the least I could do was keep his intention alive, even if I couldn't keep his family. Money that was hid out of love oughtn't come back into the world as anything else. I wrote that down too. It's about the last thing I ever wrote in that notebook about Ezra Kane, because after that there wasn't much to write. He got better. He got quieter. He got the ranch running and running well, and he'd sit out on that new porch in the evenings, the porch he built himself, board by board, and sometimes I'd sit with him, and we wouldn't say much, and that was fine. Some friendships are built on the talking. Ours was built on the not needing to. Colleen's photograph moved out of his breast pocket, eventually. I noticed one day it wasn't there when he reached for his tobacco. I thought something was wrong. I thought maybe he'd finally lost it, and I was afraid of what that would do to him. But that wasn't it. He'd framed it, put it on the mantel in the new house, where he could see it whole and open in the light instead of hidden away wrapped in oilcloth against his heart. It's a small thing. I know it's a small thing, but I understood what it meant, and it about took the legs out from under me when I saw it. A man doesn't take his grief out of hiding until he's ready to live alongside it instead of underneath it. He was happy in the end. Not fixed. You don't get fixed from what Ezra went through, and anyone who tells you different is selling something. But happy in the way a man can be when he's finally set down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of his body. He had his land. He had his cattle. He had work that healed instead of work that just hurt. And he had Josiah Halloran's love moving quietly through the county, keeping other families whole, doing across 90 years the thing that Ezra himself had once failed to do and never forgiven himself for. The land nobody wanted made him wealthy, but that was never the fortune. I want to be clear about that now that we're at the end. The fortune in that barn was never the gold. The fortune was that a man who'd lost everything, a man who bought forgotten land precisely because it was worthless, precisely because nothing worthless can be taken from you, found in that dark old barn a way to have something worth keeping again, and a reason to keep it, and the strange grace, at the very bottom of another man's 90-year-old love, to become the person Colleen always believed he was. Ezra passed 3 winters ago, peaceful in the house he built in his sleep with her photograph on the mantel and the herd fat in the field. He was 71. He left the ranch to the fund, so it keeps on giving even now, and he left me his notebook, my own gift back to me. All those years of me writing him down, and inside the cover in his cramped old man hand, so much like Josiah's, he'd written just one line. I've read it 100 times. I'll read it 100 more. I'm not going to tell you what it said. Some love letters are only meant for the one they're addressed to. Ezra taught me that, standing in a barn full of gold, reading a dead man's words into the dark. The most valuable things a person leaves behind were never the ones you could sell. He knew that better than anyone. He paid almost nothing for that forgotten land. And it gave him back the only fortune that ever mattered right at the end, when he'd stopped believing he had any coming.